Hello, this is episode 12 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, former contributing editor to Black Belt Magazine, and I tell stories about martial arts. So, a few topics I wanted to discuss this week. First up is a recent story from New Zealand where a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt was accosted by someone and tried to get away from them, but the person pursued them, and the BJJ black belt basically took him down and controlled him until police came. And I wanted to talk about this incident because it was a nearly textbook example of what a martial artist should do when confronted by an aggressor. Now, a lot of martial artists and people in the self-defense industry, I dare say the majority of them, like to spend their time on how to physically react in situations like this. Because people typically want to know, what fighting technique do I use in that situation, or what weapons should I carry to stop an attacker like this. But not enough people pay attention to all the things that lead up to that moment of physical violence. And the things that lead up to that moment and what you do in that time period can not only prevent you from getting into a violent altercation to begin with, they can help you win the altercation if it does happen, and more than that, they can help you win any legal battle that might occur after the actual fight. In this case, Chris Bauer, who was identified as an American BJJ black belt who was in New Zealand for a competition, was out for a morning walk there when a man supposedly approached him from behind and demanded money. This might be the only thing you could criticize in what Bauer did. Judging by the account, he was caught a little off guard by someone coming up behind him. But I'm not going to be too critical of him for this because anyone can be caught by surprise. He was in a beautiful foreign country admiring the sights, and his attention may not have been what it should have. No one can be on high alert 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As much as people might like to think they can always be aware of every threat around them, you can't. Stuff happens, and that's why you train the physical aspects of martial arts, for just those situations. So like I said, I'm not going to be overly critical of him here, especially since I don't know all the circumstances, and also because everything he did after this was exactly how you would teach someone to respond to this sort of situation. Bauer apparently backed away from the man, trying not to confront him, and when the man persisted, Bauer ran away. Now, take note, this is a guy who is obviously a super high-level martial artist. He's good enough to go overseas for an international competition. But still, he's not looking to throw down with some stranger on foreign turf. He didn't let his ego take over. He did the smart thing and tried to walk away, and when that didn't work, he tried to run away. In a lot of cases, that would be enough to make a criminal lose interest. They may not want to attract too much attention to themselves, and simply may not want to expend the energy of having to chase after someone who won't easily give in to their demands. But in this case, the attacker did pursue him. So again, Bauer did the textbook thing that you'd recommend anyone do in this situation. He found a crowded public place, a local cafe where people were eating, and he ran in there. Once more, that's going to discourage a large number of attackers from pursuing this any further. Because now there are lots of witnesses to the crime, and some of those witnesses might even help the victim out. So only a very desperate or very stupid criminal is going to keep pushing things at this point. But this guy was apparently either very desperate or very stupid because he pursued Bauer into the cafe and allegedly attacked him charging at Bauer. At that point, Bauer did what he's trained many years to do. He took the guy down, got his back, and controlled him until police came to arrest the assailant. He didn't try to mount him and smash his face in. He didn't pull out a pocket knife and slit the guy's throat. He used the minimal amount of force necessary to keep himself safe without any excessive harm to the criminal. Contrast this to another recent case where a kickboxing instructor in Belgium caught someone burglarizing a store and confronted them. He claimed the person attacked him and he knocked the guy out with one blow, which is fine. The other person was committing a crime, and the kickboxer, if he was being attacked, had the right to defend himself. But then witnesses to the incident said the kickboxing instructor proceeded to kick the burglar several times as he was laying unconscious, which ended up getting the kickboxer convicted of a crime and sentenced to 80 hours of community service. Meanwhile, as far as I can tell from what's been reported, Chris Bauer found himself in no trouble at all with the authorities in New Zealand. And that's why I say he handled everything in a textbook manner for self-defense. He did everything possible to avoid the altercation. He only used physical force to defend himself when he had no other choice, and he was in control of himself enough to only use the amount of force necessary to keep himself from harm. And when he did use force, he did it in a very expert manner. While that last part is important, just as important, and maybe more important, is everything he did leading up to that moment, and martial artists should take those lessons in particular to heart. Turning to the world of mixed martial arts, Merab Dvalishvili, I know I always butcher that last name, but he defeated Sean O'Malley for the UFC bantamweight title recently, and that really wasn't a surprise, at least not to me. The odds were pretty close on this going in. I think O'Malley may have ended up as a very slight favorite, but I felt Merab had the edge all along based on styles, and that was how it played out. Merab did what he always does, which was unrelenting wrestling, taking his man down and sticking to him like glue, controlling him on the mat for long periods of time. He didn't inflict huge damage down there or ever get really close on a submission. I don't think he even made that many submission attempts, but he grinded out a win like he always does. And what I did find interesting here that I don't think has been emphasized enough is that Merab's style of fighting has really become the most dominant style of fighting in the UFC right now, which no one has an answer for at the moment. I'm not talking about him specifically, I'm talking about his style of fighting. And this is basically the same style that Khabib Nurmagomedov made popular and won the lightweight title with a few years ago. And no one could ever figure out how to beat him. He just went relentlessly for takedowns, and when he got them, he stuck to the other guy like glue. And if he got a stoppage along the way, fine. But basically, it was all about dragging the fight into his territory and keeping it there. And his protege, Islam Makhachev, uses a similar style. And Khamzat Chimaev, who looks like he could definitely win a UFC title if he can ever stay healthy long enough, uses a similar style. Not to say these guys don't have other skills, because they do. They can all do just enough on their feet to keep their opponent honest, keep him guessing, avoid getting easily knocked out while finding their opening for a takedown. In the case of Makhachev, he seems to have actually made the stand-up striking aspect of the game a real weapon for him as well, having knocked out Alexander Volkanovski in their last fight with a head kick. But even he, when push comes to shove, is a grinded-out wrestler / ground fighter. O'Malley, on the face of it, might have had a style to give Merab a lot of trouble, in that one way to neutralize the wrestler is to just move a lot and not give the wrestler a chance to get his hands on you. And O'Malley certainly has good movement, but movement by itself can't win you the fight. And you can't count on it to keep the opponent from taking you down forever, as we saw in this fight where Merab was eventually able to get his hands on O'Malley and take him down in all 5 rounds. What you need besides movement to defeat an opponent like this is terrific one-shot knockout power, which I don't think O'Malley really has. He's a technically very good striker with a little bit of power, but he's not the kind of guy that consistently puts people out with that one huge shot. Conor McGregor, on the other hand, has that kind of one-shot knockout power, but he lost to Khabib Nurmagomedov as well, because he really was never the kind of fighter who made use of a lot of defensive movement and trying to avoid an opponent. He was the kind of fighter who liked to stand in front of an opponent and unleash his offense to knock him out, which you can get away with against another striker if you're as good as McGregor used to be. You can even get away with it against a lower level wrestler or grappler. But against a super high level guy like Khabib, you can't just stand there in front of him and expect not to get taken down and controlled on the mat. So really, unless you have that very rare combination of incredible movement skills and incredible one-shot knockout power, it's very difficult to deal with relentless pressuring wrestler grappler type fighters like this. And like I said, this guy seems to be as close to having an unbeatable style as you see in the UFC right now. The thing is, all these guys that I'm talking about come out of a similar background, an Eastern European grappling background that mixes sambo with wrestling. Now, there are certainly fighters from other regions, in particular a lot of very skilled American wrestlers, who could potentially imitate this style and maybe have similar success, but you don't really see that. Part of this is, as I pointed out, that you can't be just a wrestler or grappler in MMA anymore. Ben Askren is the perfect example of that. He was a tremendous wrestler, went to the Olympics, and in terms of pure wrestling skills was as good as anyone in MMA. But he fizzled out very quickly once he got to the UFC and started facing decent competition because wrestling was all he had. He never bothered to develop any of these other skills, particularly the stand-up striking aspects of the game that would allow him to not get knocked out on his feet long enough to get in close and work his wrestling. He wasn't even a mild threat to the opponent on the feet with his striking. But that's actually the exception nowadays. Instead, the reason you don't see many American wrestlers trying to imitate the style of guys like Merab and Khabib is that a lot of them do learn a bit of striking, and because some of these guys are phenomenal athletes and incredibly powerful, they get some success against inferior opponents, knocking those guys out, and suddenly they get away from their wrestling and think they're strikers who can just KO everyone. Maybe they start to not train their wrestling as much and lose a little bit of their edge in that realm while just concentrating on their boxing in the gym, but that's not their game. And when they get in with a really good striker, they end up paying for it. They get beat up on the feet, and because they haven't kept their wrestling skills as sharp, they haven't gone into the fight with the explicit game plan of dragging their opponent to the mat at all costs, they can no longer execute the wrestling quite as expertly as they used to be able to. Justin Gaethje, who came into the sport as a wrestler but is now a stand-up brawler, is an example of this. But the other big part of this that no one talks about is the promotional, crowd-pleasing aspect of a fighter's style. The kind of grinded-out strategy that fighters like Merab have used so effectively isn't a tremendously crowd-pleasing style, and it's not generally what the promoters want to see from a fighter. People think of MMA as purely a sport like football or basketball, where the athletes go out there with winning as their only priority, and that they will play in whatever manner is necessary to secure a victory. But that's not really the case for a lot of fighters. I remember years ago Ricardo Laborio, who was a famous Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu champion that founded American Top Team, which is still one of the premier MMA gyms in the world. They've produced several UFC champions. What he said to me was he could produce fighters who never lose, but they'd be so boring they'd never get fights. Now, that's obviously a bit of an overstatement that his fighters would never lose, but still, the point he was making is a valid one, that he could train guys a certain way to fight in what many would perceive to be a boring, safety-first style. But it would be enough to control or frustrate most opponents and usually earn a win. Again, though, promoters don't want to see that on their cards. They want bloody stand-up brawls because that's what excites most of the fans. So they're going to be less likely to feature fighters with a boring style on their shows. The big shows like the UFC might be less likely to even sign a fighter like that. And you see this in the performance bonuses the UFC hands out. Guys get these bonuses for engaging in knockdown, drag-out brawls where they just stand in front of each other, smashing each other with punches and kicks, or they get these bonuses for spectacular finishes. But you don't usually see them get a bonus for a boring fight, even if the fighter completely dominates it and doesn't take any damage. And don't kid yourself, those performance bonuses and fight of the night bonuses make a big financial difference to fighters. I think they're around $50,000 for a bonus now, whereas a guy fighting at the bottom of the card might make $10,000 to fight. And I think it's maybe another $10,000 as a win bonus. I'm not sure the exact amount, but I think it's around something like $10,000 for a win. So when you look at it, you can go out there and fight a flawless but very boring fight, take no damage, win the fight easily, and leave with $20,000. Or you can engage in a bloody brawl where you lose, but still might get a fight of the night bonus and walk away with a total of $60,000. That's a big difference, especially if you're only fighting a couple of times a year. So you can see why guys are tempted to fight in a more reckless manner, even if it's less likely to bring them a win. Now, if you're one of those few guys who is good enough to always win in a less exciting fashion, the way Merab has been, it may be worth it to say, I'm just going to fight my fight and not care about the promoters or the crowd because I only care about winning. Because if you win almost every fight, I think Merab had won 10 straight leading up to his title shot against O'Malley. You basically force them to keep using you, keep moving you up the ladder, and eventually give you a title shot. But if you're not quite that good, if you will win most of your fights this way but lose some, it may not be to your benefit to go out there and fight your best fight if that best fighting style of yours is a boring one. The UFC might keep around a super boring fighter who has gone 6-0 for them, but if it's a super boring fighter with, say, a 4-2 record, they may cut that guy. So as long as there are other factors at play besides just winning and losing fights, I don't know that you'll see this style of fighting that guys like Merab and Khabib have used so effectively ever become too widespread in the UFC. But for now, when a fighter of this caliber does use that kind of style, there's no easy counter to it. Finally, I saw a news article the other day from Australia about a high-ranking Japanese Aikido practitioner who, after having a school there for 30 years, is being forced to close it down due to a lack of students, and he blamed, quote, keyboard warriors for constant criticism on the internet that have made Aikido look like a weak, ineffective martial art. The instructor's name is Michiharu Mori, and he's an 8th dan in Yoshinkan Aikido, which is actually considered one of the rougher, more, I guess you'd say, aggressive styles of Aikido, though Aikido in general is not known as a particularly rough, tough kind of fighting style. But from what I know of it, Yoshinkan does get into some fairly grueling training at times. However, the article points out that Aikido primarily emphasizes peace and non-aggression rather than fighting. There's a lot of controversy and misunderstanding about this. From what I've learned about Aikido history, its founder, Morihei Ueshiba, was originally teaching Aikijitsu or Aikijujitsu, which was basically a classic style of Japanese stand-up jiu-jitsu featuring a lot of wrist locks and arm locks, and it was at least originally billed as an effective fighting system. Ueshiba was involved in a kind of strange religious cult back then and incorporated some of that group's ideas of universal harmony or whatever into his martial arts, but the idea was it was still basically that kind of classic Japanese stand-up jiu-jitsu style, which theoretically was primarily about effective close combat. And prior to the beginning of World War II, Uyeshiba was teaching at the Japanese Naval Academy and the Army Spy School. And I don't know what his curriculum was, but I doubt he was teaching primarily peace and non aggression to the military at the height of Japan's fascist expansionistic period. But the military eventually stopped using Ueshiba, from what I've read, because they thought his style was just too complicated and impractical to be used in actual combat, at least without many years of training in it. And again, from what I've read and been told by people who've looked at the history of Aikido, the idea that Aikido was primarily about peace and non aggression only came about after Ueshiba was basically fired from teaching the military and started calling what he was doing Aikido. And really, primarily became about this after World War II, when peace and non aggression started seeming like more appealing ideas in Japan. Now, I'm not going to say that Aikido can't have some use in real world physical confrontations. My guest last episode, Matt Little, was a special forces soldier, a Chicago police SWAT officer who was trained in a lot of different martial arts. It was a great interview. I'd encourage people to listen to it if they haven't. But among the many martial arts Matt has studied intensely was Aikido. And his opinion was that by itself, Aikido won't make you a fighter. But if you've developed fighting skills training in other arts, Aikido has some things that can enhance that. You know, it can teach you about angles and timing and going with an opponent's strength rather than directly resisting him. And yes, those are all useful things to learn. Now, whether Aikido is the best forum to learn those in, I don't know. I've got very limited experience training in it. I did it for maybe a month back in college, but it wasn't really for me. So maybe it does offer these methods in a better manner than other arts do, or maybe you can get the exact same things from other arts, which would also teach you how to fight from the beginning. I don't know. But Aikido, from a practical perspective, is a very misunderstood art. Like I said, the basis of it comes from Aikijitsu, which is more or less a classic type of stand-up Japanese jiu-jitsu, what my friend Ellis Amdor, who has also been on the show, calls arm-length grappling, where you're not clinching with an opponent or going to the ground with him. You're attempting to control him at arm's length just by somehow twisting or manipulating his arm. And quite frankly, that's not effective in any kind of all-out one-on-one fight, let alone if you're by yourself taking on multiple opponents. And you'll see demonstrations where Aikidoka are throwing around 2 or 3 guys at a time, but those are demonstrations and have nothing to do with reality. The only way that kind of arm's-length wrestling works in an all-out one-on-one fight against a dedicated opponent is if you first stun the opponent with a big strike that wobbles him, or if you're just twice as big as the opponent. But in either of those cases, you can make almost any technique work then, and there's probably ones you can make work much more easily than those you'd find in Aikido or any of the other arm's-length jiu-jitsu styles. From what I've gathered researching this, those kind of techniques were never meant to be used in a one-on-one all-out fight, though. What they seem to have been created for was to be used by town guards in feudal Japan to control unruly people. And the town guards weren't operating on their own. They were working in groups. So when a drunken samurai started running amok, one guard might hold him around the legs and another might hold his left arm, and you'd grab his right arm and put a wrist lock or something on him to cause him enough pain to comply and go along with you to the jail. And those kind of compliance holds were necessary back then because, first of all, just like nowadays, the Japanese didn't want their town guards, essentially their police force, killing every single troublemaker and littering the town with bodies. But more than that, this was a feudal society with a very strict hierarchy. those in the top class, the samurai class, actually had a legal right to kill any non-samurai whenever they wanted. Much has been made over that, and I'm not sure it was always applicable in all areas of Japan throughout the whole of the Tokugawa period. I don't think it was ever employed all that much in any case, but still, it was, at least in some areas and times, legal for a samurai to kill a non-samurai in theory for whatever reason he wanted to. The town guards came mostly from lower classes or sometimes from the bottom rung of the samurai class, I believe. But if you were a non-samurai arresting a samurai for causing trouble and you broke his jaw with a punch, when he got out of jail, he might have the legal right to come looking for you and cut your head off. And even for the people on the lower end of the samurai class who were guards, this was a society where vendettas were still not completely a thing of the past. So if you killed or gravely wounded a samurai trying to arrest him, his family might well come looking for you. So for all these reasons, it made sense to have a means of controlling an opponent without seriously injuring him. And that's something that could be applied to modern police work, if it was used in the same way as part of a team tactic that police actually worked on together. But for fighting by yourself against an opponent who is really trying to oppose and hurt you, no. I'm sorry, but Aikido by itself is not going to do much for you. Ellis had said to me when he was training in Japan, in Aikido, with a lot of the best Aikidoka alive back then, when he'd watch these masters do some freestyle exchanges in the dojo, whenever one of them would start to get into trouble, they'd automatically revert to judo techniques, which they'd all studied, rather than Aikido. So even the best Aikidoka working under controlled circumstances apparently had to rely on something else when they really needed to win a fight. That doesn't invalidate Aikido as a martial art, the emphasis on art here. Mochiharu Mori pointed out in this article that it wasn't so much an art of defeating an opponent as harmonizing with him, and that can be applied to many areas of life, not just fighting. And I tend to agree with that. As I've pointed out many times before on this show, martial arts don't have to be solely about fighting or about self-defense. They can be about self-discipline, self-improvement, the aesthetics of practicing a movement art the same as dance or yoga. And I think from this perspective, there is a place for Aikido the way there's a place for Tai Chi when it's primarily promoted as a movement art or as a means of exercise that won't overly tax your body. The problem is very few people promote Aikido in that manner. Even when someone talks about Aikido as a spiritual discipline, they also work in somehow touting its benefits for self-defense, which is not only a little self-contradictory, but, as I just pointed out, is kind of ludicrous when you talk about it as an effective method of self-defense. And Mori's school itself seems to be doing just that. If you look at the website for his Goshiru Aikijutsu school, it says they teach realistically usable techniques on the streets against all sorts of strikes, punches, and kicks. Now, I don't know exactly what they're teaching there, but if it's anything like any of the other arm-length grappling I've seen, whether that's from Yoshinkan Aikido, from Daito-Ryu Aikijujitsu, or wherever else, it's just not that realistically usable. We know at this point what is realistically usable in an unarmed physical fight against punches and kicks, and that's not arm-length grappling, unless, like I said, you hit the guy first or just a lot bigger. And in those cases, it's your striking or your size that's winning the fight for you, not your Aikido. And in this article, Mori's student, who it says is continuing to teach Aikido in Australia, echoes this. He says he wants to repair the reputational damage done to Aikido, that its focus is self-defense to guard against an assailant rather than attacking with punches and kicks. Again, I haven't seen what these guys do and how they train. If he's talking about self-defense from the perspective of situational awareness and avoiding confrontations, deselecting yourself from being a target, I'd agree that's what you should focus on in self-defense. But if he's talking, as I kind of suspect he is, about using the principles of Aikido in a physical confrontation to somehow avoid all your opponent's attacks and then control them without hitting them or going to the ground with them, just by controlling them by dint of somehow harmonizing with their movements, I would say he has sadly missed the point of why Aikido has lost popularity and why people are paying attention to the so-called keyboard warriors. And make no mistake, the internet is filled with a lot of really horrible people expressing incredibly stupid opinions. And they feel free to do this in very obnoxious terms because they're safely hidden behind a screen. But it's not just those people saying this. When someone like Matt Little, who has more legitimate combat experience than 99.9% of all martial artists out there combined, and has studied Aikido for years, says that on its own, Aikido won't teach you how to win a fight. You need to listen to that. So if Aikido schools want to stay open, they either have to modify what they're doing somehow, maybe bring in some other instructors who specialize in striking and ground fighting to also teach in those schools, or they need to just admit this is not about fighting. Any skills you get are completely incidental or something you might be able to add to your repertoire only if you're already a highly skilled fighter coming in. But instead, they should be saying Aikido is about learning a graceful, aesthetically pleasing form of physical movement. It's about developing discipline. It's about learning ways to deal with aggression that don't involve violence. It's about learning things from a different culture. Or maybe it's just about having some fun doing some throws and rolls in a gym. Just don't lie to your students and don't lie to yourself that it's about doing effective physical self-defense. That's all I've got for this week. Thank you for listening. As always, thank you to the Black Swan, Eleanor Academia, for providing the music to the show. You can find a link to her website down in the show notes, along with a link to my own website. Until next time, keep punching.